June 14, 2012. The heat had already settled over Greene County, Iowa, before noon, pressing down on the fields like something heavy and unspoken. Dust hung in the air along County Road E17, and from a distance you could hear engines long before you saw them. 3 flatbed trucks rolled in one after another, slow and deliberate, like a funeral procession that didn't care who was watching. At the end of that road stood a narrow stretch of land most people in town had stopped noticing years ago. A crooked fence, a weather-beaten barn, and behind it, a deep ravine that cut through the earth like an old scar. That was Elias Turner's land, and that was where they decided to dump everything. The first truck tilted its bed with a groan, metal grinding against metal. A rusted tractor slid backward, scraping, resisting, then finally giving in. It tipped over the edge of the ravine and disappeared into the shadows below, with a hollow crash that echoed longer than it should have. Elias was already there when it happened, huh? He stood near the fence line, hat pulled low, one hand resting on the wood, as if he could feel the land through it. He didn't move, didn't shout, didn't run forward. He just watched. Another truck backed in, and then another. More broken machines followed tractors, with seized engines. Frames bent out of shape wheels, missing, paint peeled away by years of use and neglect. To anyone else, they were scrap. Dead weight. The kind of things you got rid of when it cost more to fix than to replace. But this wasn't just any ditch, and this wasn't just anyone's land. What happened next would become the kind of story people in Greene County would repeat for years. Though not always the same way, because what they saw that day was not the whole truth. By the time the second truck emptied its load, a small group had gathered along the roadside. Farmhands. A few neighbors, even a couple of men from town, who had heard about the disposal deal and came just to watch. At the center of it all stood Calvin Brooks. Tall, clean boots, crisp shirt even in that heat. The kind of man who didn't sweat unless he wanted to. Calvin owned Brooks Agri Supply, the biggest equipment dealership in 3 counties. New machines, financing plans, service contracts. If you farmed within 50 miles, you knew his name whether you liked it or not. And right now he was smiling. "Well," Calvin said, glancing over at Elias without really looking at him. "Seems like we finally found a good use for that hole of yours." A few men chuckled. Elias didn't answer. Calvin stepped closer, brushing dust off his sleeve, as if the land itself offended him. "You don't use it. Nobody does." County signed off. Figured we'd save everyone the trouble and make it official. He gestured toward the ravine where another machine had just slammed into the pile below. "Recycling," he added almost casually. "Or something like it." There was another round of laughter. Someone from the back called out, "Hey, Elias, you planning to fix those too?" More laughter. Louder this time. Elias finally shifted his weight, his boots pressing into the dry earth. He looked down into the ravine eyes, tracing the twisted shapes now scattered along the bottom. "They're not yours to throw," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Calvin turned eyebrows, lifting just slightly, like he'd been waiting for that. "Not mine," he repeated. "Last I checked, every one of those machines was paid for, replaced, upgraded." He tapped the side of one of the trucks. "You're looking at yesterday's problems, Elias. We're dealing with tomorrow." He took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough that it sounded almost friendly. "You've been holding on to scraps your whole life," Calvin said. "Rust bolts things nobody else wants. Maybe it's time you admit. Some things are meant to be left behind." A few of the younger men nodded. One of them muttered, "Old junk collector." Calvin didn't correct him. Instead, he turned back to the drivers. "Go ahead," he said. "Dump the rest." The third truck bed. This one carried something bigger, a wide-frame tractor, older than most of the others, its faded green paint barely visible beneath layers of grime. One wheel hung loose. The engine housing was cracked. It looked finished. Even the men watching went quiet for a second. That one, Calvin said, almost amused, was supposed to be a custom job back in the day. Fancy idea. Didn't last. He glanced at Elias again. If it's so valuable, he added, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Why don't you fix it yourself? The truck tipped. The tractor slid. For a brief moment, it caught on the edge of the ravine like it was hesitating. Then gravity won. It dropped. The impact sent a dull, heavy sound through the ground, followed by a cascade of smaller parts, shifting and settling beneath it. Dust rose up from the ravine floor, drifting slowly into the sunlight. And through all of it, Elias didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the place where that last machine had fallen, as if he was seeing something no one else could. What most people remembered about that day was the laughter. What they didn't notice was the way Elias's hand tightened slightly on the fence, or how after the trucks were gone and the crowd began to disperse, he walked down the narrow path that led into the ravine, alone. Because to everyone else, that place had just become a junkyard, but to Elias Turner, it had always been something else entirely. And to understand why, you have to go back much further than that summer, long before Calvin Brooks ever bought his first dealership, long before new machines replaced the old ones, back to a time when things were built differently, and so were the men who worked on them. Elias grew up on that same piece of land, when the barn still stood straight, and the fence hadn't yet begun to lean. Back when the fields were worked not by contracts or service plans, but by hands that knew every inch of soil and every sound a machine could make. His father, Walter Turner, had come back from the war with more than just stories. He brought back a way of thinking. Walter had been a mechanic in the Army, not the kind who just followed manuals, but the kind who could take apart an engine blindfolded and tell you what was wrong just by how it resisted. People said he could hear problems before they happened, said he didn't fix machines. He understood them. Elias was 10 the first time his father let him hold a wrench, not to tighten anything, just to listen. Don't look at it, Walter told him, tapping the side of an old engine block. Close your eyes. Elias did. What do you hear? At first nothing made sense, just small sounds, ticks, shifts, metal settling. Again, his father said. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and slowly Elias began to understand. Every machine had a rhythm, a pattern, a way it moved when it was healthy, and a different way when something was wrong. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You had to respect it. That ravine behind the barn, it wasn't there by accident. Walter had started using it decades earlier, not as a place to throw things away, but as a place to keep them. Machines too damaged to fix right away, parts that might be needed someday, engines that still had life in them, even if no one else could see it. Nothing's useless, Walter used to say. Just misunderstood. Or waiting. Most people in town didn't get it. They saw piles of metal and called it clutter. Walter saw possibilities, and Elias, he inherited that way of seeing. After Walter passed, the land stayed with Elias. Offers came and went. Developers, neighbors. Even Calvin, years later, tried to buy a portion of it. Elias refused every time, not out of stubbornness, but because he knew what was there. He didn't farm like the others, didn't chase the newest equipment or the biggest yields. He worked slower, quieter, fixing what he had, rebuilding what others threw away. People started talking, said he was stuck in the past, said he didn't understand how things worked anymore. And maybe from the outside, that's exactly how it looked. A man alone, surrounded by broken machines, living on land nobody else wanted. But there was something about that ravine, something no one else in Greene County ever bothered to ask about. Because if they had, they might have realized much sooner that Elias Turner wasn't collecting junk. He was building something, piece by piece, machine by machine, year after year. And what he would eventually uncover down there would change everything they thought they knew, just not in the way they expected. For weeks after that summer afternoon, the ravine didn't change much. At least, not in any way people could see from the road. From distance, it still looked like a graveyard. Twisted metal, broken frames, sun-bleached tires scattered at awkward angles. The kind of place you glanced at once, then looked away from as if it might remind you of something you didn't want to think about. But if you came closer, if you walked past the fence down the narrow dirt path that curved along the edge and disappeared into shadow, you would have noticed something different. Tracks, fresh ones, not from trucks, from something being dragged, slowly, deliberately, out of the ravine. Elias didn't rush. He never did. Each morning before the heat rose too high, he would make his way down into that scar, in the earth boots, sinking slightly into the loose soil, hands steady, eyes scanning the pile, like a man reading a map only he could understand. He didn't start with the newest machines. He didn't start with the easiest ones either. He started with the ones that looked the worst, because those he knew were the ones people had given up on too quickly. By late July, a few folks began to notice. Old Mr. Hanley, who lived half a mile down the road, was the first to mention it at the diner. "Seen Turner pulling parts out of that hole," he said, stirring his coffee without looking up. "Not scrap either. Good pieces." A younger farmer laughed. "Good pieces." From that mess, Hanley shrugged. "Depends what you're looking for." But most people didn't care enough to look twice. They were busy. Calvin Brooks had rolled out his new line of equipment that seasoned, sleek, polished machines with digital panels and sealed systems that promised efficiency, speed, and something he liked to call future-proof farming. Contracts were signed. Old machines were traded in, and one by one, those machines found their way into Elias's ravine. What nobody realized was that Elias wasn't just salvaging parts. He was choosing, carefully, deliberately, like a man assembling something that didn't exist yet. There was one machine in particular he kept coming back to, the one Calvin had pointed out the day they dumped it, the wide-frame tractor. At first glance, it looked beyond saving. The chassis had taken a hard hit. The engine housing was cracked open like a split shell. Most men wouldn't have even tried, but Elias didn't see what it was. He saw what it had been, and more importantly, what it still could be. He cleared the debris around it first, piece by piece, until the machine sat alone, exposed to the light filtering down into the ravine. Then he began the slow work of bringing it back up, not all at once, not with force, but with patience, chains, leverage, timing. It took him 3 days. No one helped him. No one even knew he was doing it, until on the 4th morning that old tractor stood beside his barn, tilted, slightly silent, but no longer buried. That was when things started to shift. Because there was something about that machine, something that didn't quite match the others. Elias noticed it the moment he opened the engine housing. The damage was real, but underneath it, hidden beneath layers of grease and dust, was a structure he hadn't seen in years. Reinforced joints, a modified crankshaft, and then something even more unusual. He paused, wiped his hands slowly on a rag, and leaned in closer. Because what he found inside that engine wasn't factory work. Not exactly. The configuration was familiar, but different. Someone had taken the original design and pushed it further. Adjusted tolerances, increased the compression ratio beyond what the model was supposed to handle. And somehow, it hadn't destroyed itself. It had held. Elias stepped back slightly, eyes narrowing. There was only one person he had ever known who worked like that. Only one man who believed machines weren't limited by what they were built to do, but by what people expected from them. His father. But that didn't make sense. Walter Turner had never worked on this model. Not officially. Not for any company. And certainly not for something that had ended up in Calvin Brooks's inventory decades later. Unless Elias reached deeper into the engine bay, fingers brushing against something small, wedged near the rear mount. A metal plate, thin, unmarked at first glance. He pulled it free, wiped it clean, and then he saw it. A single engraving. WT, barely visible. Easy to miss, but unmistakable. Elias didn't say anything, didn't react the way most people would. He just stood there, holding that small piece of metal in his hand, as the memory settled quietly into place. This machine was never just another tractor. It had passed through his father's hands, changed, rebuilt, improved in ways no manual would ever explain. And if that was true, then everything about it mattered, more than anyone else could understand. What he realized next was something nobody in Greene County was prepared for, because while Calvin and the others were investing in newer, smarter machines, they had overlooked something older, something simpler, something far more resilient. By early September, the weather turned, not all at once, but enough that people began to feel it. The rains didn't come when they were supposed to. Fuel prices crept higher, then higher still, and with it came the first signs of trouble. At first it was small things. A system glitch here, a sensor failure there, machines stalling in the middle of fields for no clear reason. Farmers called Calvin's service teams. Appointments were scheduled, parts were ordered, but the fixes took time. And time was something the harvest didn't allow. One morning, just outside of town, a brand new tractor shut down completely halfway through a field. No warning, no visible damage, just silence. The farmer stood there staring at a machine worth more than his father's entire farm had been 30 years earlier, and it wouldn't move. That story spread quickly. Then another, then another. Within weeks, it wasn't just a few isolated issues. It was a pattern. The new machines, precise, efficient, advanced, were also fragile. Too dependent on systems no one in the field could fix. Too sensitive to conditions they weren't built to handle. And when they stopped, everything stopped with them. Meanwhile, just beyond the edge of town, something else was happening. Something quieter, but far more important. Because behind that crooked fence, in front of that leaning barn, Elias Turner had started an engine. The sound didn't carry far. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, deep, certain, and for the first time in years, that old ravine wasn't silent anymore. By mid-September, the sound of stalled engines had become more common than the sound of working ones. It didn't happen all at once. That's not how these things ever happen. At first, it was one farmer waiting longer than expected for a repair. Then another, canceling a harvest window because a part hadn't arrived. Then a third, standing in the middle of his own land, staring at a machine that had cost him more than his house, and realizing he couldn't even open it without voiding the warranty. And somewhere in the middle of all that, people started remembering Elias Turner, not loudly, not proudly, but quietly. The way people remember something they once laughed at. The first one to go to him was a man named Curtis Hale. Curtis wasn't desperate yet, not completely. But his machine had shut down twice in the same week, and the service team from Brooks Agri Supply had told him it might be another 10 days before they could get the right diagnostic module. 10 days, in the middle of harvest. So Curtis drove out to the Turner place early one morning, before anyone else would see his truck parked there. He didn't honk, didn't call out. He just stood by the fence, hat in his hands, waiting. Elias noticed him after a while. He walked over slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth darkened by oil and time. Curtis cleared his throat. "Heard you got something running again," he said, not quite meeting Elias's eyes. Elias didn't answer right away. He just nodded towards the barn. "Come see." Inside, the air was cooler, still heavy, but quieter somehow. And there, sitting in the half-light, was the machine Elias had pulled from the ravine. The same one. The wide-frame tractor, except now, it didn't look dead anymore. It looked awake. Curtis stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "That thing," he said, "that was in the pit." Elias nodded. Curtis let out a short breath. It run. Elias didn't explain. He just reached up, turned the ignition. The engine didn't hesitate. It didn't stutter or struggle. It came to life in one smooth, grounded motion, low and steady, like it had been waiting for that moment. Curtis froze, because what he heard wasn't just an engine. It was something solid, reliable, simple in a way his own machine no longer was. He walked around it slowly, almost cautiously. "What did you do to it?" Elias looked at the machine, not at Curtis. "Nothing." "It wasn't meant to do," he said. Curtis frowned slightly, like he didn't fully understand, but something in his expression shifted. "Think it could pull?" he asked. Elias didn't answer with words. He shut the engine off, then motioned for Curtis to follow him outside. An hour later, that old tractor was in Curtis Hale's field. The sun was higher now. A few neighbors had noticed the unfamiliar machine and drifted closer, curiosity pulling them in. Curtis climbed into the seat, hesitated for just a second, then started it. Again. No hesitation. No warning lights. No delay. He eased it forward, at first gently, then more. The machine moved through the soil like it remembered how. Not fast, not flashy, but strong, consistent, uninterrupted. By the time Curtis reached the end of the row, the small group watching had gone completely quiet. He turned the tractor around, drove it back, then stopped in front of Elias. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, looking down at something he couldn't quite put into words. Then he climbed down. How much, Curtis asked. Elias shook his head. Bring yours, he said. We'll see what it need. That was how it started. Not with a crowd, not with a line of trucks. Just one man who stopped laughing. But things like that don't stay quiet for long. Within days, word began to spread. Not in the way Calvin's advertisements spread loud, polished, deliberate, but through conversations at the diner, through glances across fields, through the kind of stories people tell each other when they're not sure they believe them yet. Turner's got something running out there. He fixed Hale's field in a day. Old machine, too, no electronics. Runs better than mine. At first, most people dismissed it. Then a few more went to see for themselves. Then a few more. And suddenly that crooked fence on County Road E17 wasn't being ignored anymore. It was being watched. Cars slowed as they passed. Trucks parked along the roadside. Men who had laughed just weeks earlier now stood in the same dust quiet, waiting their turn to speak. And through all of it, Elias didn't change. He didn't raise his voice, didn't charge more, didn't explain more than he needed to. He just worked, pulled machines from the ravine, took them apart, rebuilt them piece by piece, and every now and then, when something truly mattered, he reached for parts no one else knew existed, parts his father had set aside, parts from machines that had been forgotten, parts that didn't follow the rules anymore. That was the part nobody understood, because this wasn't about fixing old tractors. It was about something deeper, something most of them had traded away without realizing it. And by the time they began to see it, it was already too late, because across Greene County, the failures were getting worse. Fuel costs had doubled, delays stretched into weeks, and the machines everyone had trusted were becoming liabilities. Calvin Brooks tried to keep control of it. He brought in more technicians, ordered more parts, promised faster service. But the problem wasn't just parts. It was design, systems too complex to repair in the field, machines that depended on things, suppose, that weren't always there. And when enough of them failed at once, there was no way to keep up. The breaking point came in early October. A large contract field, one of the biggest in the county, sat untouched for 2 full days. 5 machines, all down, all waiting on diagnostics that hadn't arrived. Dozens of workers standing idle. And at the center of it all, Calvin Brooks. For the first time in years, he didn't look in control. He stood there, hands on his hips, staring out at the field like it had betrayed him. Men waited for instructions. None came, because there was nothing left to say. Not until someone from somewhere in the back spoke up. Turner's got one that can pull. The words hung there, uncomfortable, unwanted, but real. Calvin didn't turn right away. He just stood there, jaw tightening slightly, because he understood something in that moment, something he hadn't needed to understand before. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival, and the only man who might be able to help him was the same one he had laughed at, the same one he had called outdated, the same one whose land he had used like a dumping ground. What happened next was the part nobody in Greene County ever forgot. Calvin arrived at this Turner place just before sunset. No convoy, no audience, just his truck, and the sound of gravel under his tires as he pulled to a stop near the fence. Elias was already outside. Of course he was. He always seemed to know when someone was coming. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt different now, heavier, quieter. Calvin stepped out of the truck slower than usual. He looked around the barn, the ravine, the machines now lined up where scrap had once been. Then finally, he looked at Elias. "I need that machine," Calvin said. No greeting, no explanation, just the truth. Elias studied him for a moment. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just understanding. For the north field, Calvin added, as if that would justify everything. Elias nodded once. Then he turned, walked toward the barn. Calvin followed. Inside the tractor, detectives stood ready. Cleaned, rebuilt, something more than what it had been. Elias climbed into the seat, started the engine, and drove it out into the fading light. Calvin watched in silence. That same low, steady sound filled the air again. Not loud, but certain. They drove out together. No words, no need. When they reached the field, people were already there, waiting, watching. And as Elias guided that machine forward, into ground that had resisted everything else, the soil gave way, row by row, steady, unstoppable, no hesitation, no failure, just movement, the kind that people hadn't seen in weeks. And slowly, the silence broke, not with shouting, not at first, but with something deeper, relief, then disbelief, then something else entirely, respect. Calvin stood at the edge of that field, saying nothing, because there was nothing left for him to say. The man he had dismissed had just done what none of his machines could, and he had done it with something that had been thrown away. When the work was finished, Elias shut the engine off. The field was ready. The crisis of Tepumaz, at least for that moment, had passed. Calvin walked toward him slower than he had ever walked before. How, he asked. It was the only question he had left. Elias stepped down from the tractor, looked out over to the field. Then back to the machine. You stopped listening, he said. That was all. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Not all at once, but enough. People stopped calling the ravine a junkyard. They started calling it something else. Didn't always have a name for it, but they knew what it meant. Calvin's business didn't disappear, but it wasn't the same. Not after that. Not after everyone had seen what happened. Because once people understand that something they threw away still has value, they don't forget it. And Elias Turner, he went back to the same life he had always lived. Same barn, same land, same quiet rhythm. He didn't expand, didn't advertise, didn't change who he was, because he had never been trying to prove anything. Not to Calvin, not to the town, not to anyone. He had simply understood something the rest of them hadn't. And in the end, that understanding had been worth more than all the new machines in the county. Because the truth is, most people don't lose because they're weak. They lose because they underestimate what they don't understand. They laugh at what looks broken. They discard what doesn't fit their idea of progress. And by the time they realize their mistake, it's already too late. But every once in a while, there's someone like Elias Turner, someone who sees value where others see waste, strength where others see failure, and possibility where everyone else has already walked away. And when that moment comes, when everything else stops working, those are the people the world turns back to. Not because they were loud, not because they were powerful, but because they never stopped paying attention.